welcome to Apollos Watered.
That's probably the most enthusiastic welcome I've ever had on any podcast I've ever been on. So good to be with you. You win, Travis. You win.
We win an award of some kind, but
That's
I'll
right.
take it. I'll take that. But are you ready for the Fast Five?
I don't know what they are, so I hope I'm ready. I'm
Okay.
going to try to be ready.
All right, here we go. First question's pretty basic. Would you rather be in the city or the country?
Oh, definitely the city.
Really? Why?
Yes.
Tell me why.
I love hustle and bustle and people. I like action, activity, all going around. I mean, the country's amazing to go away to and visit, but I definitely prefer the city. There's nothing like the energy of a city. Sorry.
Now, where are you from, though? Are you from a city, small town, big town?
I'm from outside of Nashville. So I'm from a town that was outside of Nashville, Murfreesboro, Tennessee, that has more than doubled in size since I was a teenager here. So it is now, it's basically become this city next to a big city. So yeah.
Okay. Here's the next question. Your wife is Romanian, correct?
That's right.
The best Romanian food dish is?
Oh, that would have to be just the straight up like chicken soup is spectacular, but Romanians are known for sarmale, which is this like these cabbage rolls with pork and rice inside that are like they're amazing. And I know a lot of people, they hear cabbage and they kind of turn up their nose to cabbage. There's sweet cabbage and there's more sour cabbage, but it's all really the way that it's cooked, and like it's cooked in this tomato sauce, and it's like, and there's bacon in it. So those are phenomenal.
I think Romanian dishes are some of the most underlooked, like cuisine. Romanian cuisine, it's really good. There we go. Next question. Funniest or strangest cross-cultural experience?
Funniest or strangest? Okay, definitely. I don't know if everyone would think this was funny. I think it's funny now. But when I was first learning Romanian, I did not know. You get to that stage where you're becoming fluent, but you don't know as much as you think you know, and so you just know enough to be dangerous. Okay, and I was standing at the back of a church. And one of the older ladies came out, and they all like give you kisses on both cheeks as they're walking out the church because you're there, and I was there with a translator, but I was getting enough Romanian that I could kind of have a little bit of conversation. And I basically asked her about her husband, and I thought she said her husband was sick, and so I said, I hope he recovers quickly. And the translator looked at me and said, Trevin, she just said her husband is dead. And there's a big difference between dead and sick. And so my response in Romanian was, I hope she recovers. I hope he recovers. And she looked at me really strangely. So that was one of those, I guess it's strange. It's also funny. It's also like dark humor. I don't know what category you want to put that in. But that's when I realized, okay, I do not know Romanian yet as well as I think I do. I probably need to take it easy. So.
Oh, I love the different cross-cultural experiences, especially when it comes to language.
Yes.
That's when it gets pretty funny.
You cannot become fluent unless you're ready to look like a fool. And that the humility is required to master another language, because if you don't get over that fear of looking foolish, you'll never do it. And that's one of the examples of me looking foolish. So
that is so true. All right, here we go. You're a very well-read and wide-ranging writer, but the best writer of the 20th century is?
Well, I mean, would anyone that really reads my stuff doubt that I'm going to say G.K. Chesterton? I'm a huge Chesterton fan. I know some people would say, I mean, a lot of people, there are a lot of Lewis fans out there, but Lewis got so much of his stuff from Chesterton. I think Chesterton has got to be the one of the greatest writers of the just for sheer volume of words, massive amount of words. But I don't know. I may rethink that later. Now that you've asked me that, I may go back and be like, no, I think there's actually a couple of people that probably beat Chesterton. But yeah,
we'll get to Chesterton in a bit. But I thought you might say that. That's why I was curious. And you guys couldn't be more total opposite. I mean, just from like, he's a large guy. You're not a large guy.
No, no, not at all. And was huge personality, huge,
Just,
physically very
yeah.
imposing. Yes, for sure.
How tall was he?
He was, I think it was like 6'3" or something,
Okay.
like 6'4". But I mean, it was just massive, like
He was like over 300 pounds too, wasn't
yeah,
he? He was
most of
big.
his life. Yeah. So definitely was he. There's a funny story with him and George Bernard Shaw, who Shaw and Chesterton were like philosophical, ideological opposites.
Hmm.
Shaw was, socialistic, was atheist, whatnot. Well, Shaw was also very puritanical. Like
Hmm.
wouldn't drink, wouldn't like eat certain things. Well, I think he was like a vegetarian. I mean, extraordinarily skinny, and they were dear friends their whole lives. They debated all the time, but then they were all also good friends. And one time, Chesterton looked over at Shaw and said, "Man, if someone would look at from the looks of you, someone would say that a famine has come upon England." And Shaw's response was, "From the looks of you, someone would say you caused it." So, I mean, that's one of those just like those Titanic intellects, back and forth. But
I like that. That's good. Oh, I always love hearing the stories of people that were friends but rivals and those little one-liners
oh
where
yeah,
you had Spurgeon and Moody had something very similar where um, Moody said to Spurgeon, "How do you feel like God feels about your smoking?" Because he always smoked a cigar. And he
no,
said the
that's
same
right.
way
Yeah.
he feels about your eating.
Right. So speaking of Spurgeon, I actually have held in my hand the cigar that was on his person when he died.
Really?
Yes, it is at Midwestern Seminary, and I had a friend who had it, and I mean that cigar was in his pocket when he died. So yeah,
That's interesting. You've actually seen quite a bit of stuff, which we're
I
going to get to. I don't want to
yeah,
get ahead
for
of it
sure.
because
I've
you
got
had some.
stories, man.
Yeah,
I've
I
got
mean, well, you
stories.
even had some stuff. I think it was from the Wheaton archives. You had Jim Elliot's journal.
Yeah,
Right?
I've gotten to see that. I've gotten to hold that, that to look through those journals, and I mean it's yeah, the just some I've got plenty of stories of just weird things that have happened over the years where I get to we make fun of Catholics for their relics, but I think we evangelicals have our own relics
We
out there,
do.
like,
We do. We totally do. We totally do. And our own popes and a
yeah,
college of
well,
cardinals.
that's probably true. Yeah.
Okay, here we go. The last question is this in the fast five. Now it's gone into the kind of the long five, but that's okay. If you were an ethnic food, right? We've talked a little bit about food. What ethnic food besides Romanian would you be and why?
Well, all food is ethnic. So
There we
I
go.
guess
That's
you're
true.
asking me
That's true.
minority ethnic
Well, is
food.
a banana? I mean, that's a vet. I mean, that's just a fruit. But that's not
That is
ethnic.
true. That is true.
But like
Gosh,
dishes,
I'm
like a dish. Yeah, I get
like
it.
a
Okay.
dish. I mean, there's nothing to me that's better than like nachos or a taco salad. Like I love good authentic Mexican dishes. And I've got a good friend who's a Cuban,
Mm,
friend of mine, Ivan Mesa, who recently introduced me to Cuban food. And the very sharp distinctions I find out between Mexican and Cuban
Cuban
dishes.
food. It's a big deal.
There's still some similarities, I would say, and I kind of told him about them, but I will say he won me over. The Cuban dishes that I had were really good. He
Cuban
ordered
food.
for me and everything at a Cuban, at like an
Ooh,
authentic Cuban restaurant. Like I didn't even look at the
awesome.
menu. He was like, "This is what you're getting." So
That's
yeah,
awesome. I always
yeah.
love it when people get to order for you.
Well, I
You
mean, the
find out
way
what
I
kind of
look at
friend
it,
they
if you're
are.
new to a kind of cuisine, you've got to trust that other people know best. So
I was in India, northern India, and they were at this restaurant right at the foothills of the Himalayas, and they brought out the menu and it had pictures, and I pointed to it, and all my hosts got really quiet, and they brought it out, and I realized that's not what I wanted. I got it wrong, and I had them. I said, I'm sorry, that was the wrong part, and they sent it back, and my oh, my light fell there. Sorry about that. My host was like, we're pretty glad that you sent it back because that is the hottest dish that they possibly could have, which I thought
whoa,
if Indians are saying that it's hot, then it's going to be really hot for me. Really hot for me.
you would
So,
have regretted that.
totally,
Yeah.
totally would have regretted everything about it because I don't handle heat well. But let's get to the Trevin Wax story. Tell us a bit about yourself. I mean, you said you grew up in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and I mean, we know you write a lot of different things. You work with the North American Mission Board. You're an adjunct professor at Wheaton. You've worked at Lifeway. I mean, you're with the Gospel Coalition. You're all over the place. But let's get a little bit of background into the Trevin Wax story. So share a bit of that, if you will.
Yeah, so I grew up in Middle Tennessee, and I guess the thing that started to kind of carve these other paths for me was I went to I started going on mission trips when I was 15 years old to Romania. That's what kind of ignited my passion and desire for missions, for cross-cultural ministry, and went every year as a teenager doing different things. I mean, we'd had evangelistic trips, but then also we'd fit people for eyeglasses. Did pulled a lot of teeth, did dental work, general medicine type stuff as well, youth events, all sorts of things. So did that. When I graduated high school, I took a gap year before anyone called it a gap year, partly just because I wasn't sure what I was going to do exactly, but also because I wanted to have some time to work and make some money that would go to my college. I didn't want to wind up out of college and in a lot of debt. And it was during that year that God redirected my plans to a Christian university in the US to going to a Christian university in Romania instead. So I wound up, I bought a one-way ticket when I was 19, moved over to Romania, learned the language, was there for I was there for 5 years, did my undergrad there. I met my wife there. We had our first son who's about to graduate high school. We had him when I was a student there. And then came back, did about 18 months on campus at Southern Seminary, and then did the rest of it from a distance while I was an associate pastor in Tennessee. And all this time I was writing a lot. So I've been a writer ever since I was a kid. I've written stories, I've written essays, I've written journals, thoughts, all, ever since I was little. But kept working on that craft and discipline in my 20s. And then by my late 20s, that was when I had a first publisher want to publish something from me. So I did a proposal. It was accepted by Crossway, and so I was so when I was 29, that my first book came out. And then shortly after that, Moody wanted a second book, so I started doing that. And then I wound up going to Lifeway shortly after that and was there for about 11 years. We launched something called the Gospel Project, which is a curriculum for all ages that shows how all the scriptures point to Jesus. I did that for about half the time. And then the other half of the time, I helped launch the CSB, the Christian Standard Bible Translation, and was there on, at Lifeway doing a number of other things, working with an amazing team, just people all across that organization, learning a lot. And since last August, have been at the North American Mission Board, doing research and resource development. So I lead a team that is providing free resources for pastors, for church planters, places like newchurches.com. You can go and there's all sorts of courses and things that people can get absolutely free. So that's been exciting for us to be able to launch and do in the previous few months.
That's pretty awesome. And that's a lot of experience. Are you still pastoring?
So I was teaching pastor at our church from 2017 until I guess a little before the pandemic hit. So I was doing that while I was also doing Lifeway. So it was I was a part-time teaching pastor, but I was preaching 40 weeks a year. So it was kind of like,
I'd hate to see if you went full-time.
Yeah, like the part-time in quotations, but no, so I've been able to do that. I recently wrapped up an interim preaching role at a church in the Nashville area that I was able to be at for about 10 months, which was fantastic. So I still get to get out and get to do preaching and teaching and whatnot, but I'm not currently pastoring anywhere.
So a little bit of a break as you write more books, and that's why you probably had more blog entries.
This is one of the reasons. It was a question of calling for me. I came down, I'd been doing the teaching pastor thing for 2 years. And I just got to this realization where I knew All of my creative energies, it wasn't a time question. It was really creativity was all going into sermon prep.
Mm.
And I thought there's no way I can write a book if I'm preaching 40 weeks a year. It was just too much. And so I had to come to that point of decision to say, okay, God, what do you really want me to do the most? Like, what am I best at? Am I better at preaching or better at writing? Because if I've got to choose one, and for me, the writing was always higher than the preaching, as much as I love to preach. So the preaching is now more of an intermittent type thing, and I can write all the time. And the writing is really where I think the Lord has called and gifted me the most.
Which I would agree. I mean, I've not heard you preach. I've seen you do videos and interviews and conversations, but I know your writing has affected a lot of different people. So let's talk a bit about the writing, because you have a wide array of topics that you write about. And your most recent book is the annotated version of G.K. Chesterton's, as you've already mentioned, book done over 100 years ago, which is incredible to me. That when I first saw the book come out, I went, what in the world is he writing about G.K. Chesterton's book that came out over 100 years ago? Why do an annotated version of this book and have it released today?
Well, the book has never been out of print. It's a classic. It's considered a classic by all kinds of people, apologetics people, theologians, Christians, thoughtful Christians have read it for more than 100 years now. I mean, C.S. Lewis was obviously influenced by it. Orthodoxy is a classic, but it's a hard book to read. And a lot of times people read the book the first time, or they get halfway through the book or even a third of the way through the book, and they're like, I'm not tracking. And it's one of those books, like, I mean, I read it my first time back in 2010, 2011. And I don't even know that I understood a quarter of it, what I was reading. It was dense, but it was also brilliant. There were these sentences and certain paragraphs that were just jaw-dropping, right? Just, I mean, burst off the page kind of insight. So it was like I've compared it to being in this, you feel like you're making your way through a dense jungle and you're finding nuggets of gold everywhere, but you really don't know the path you're on. You're just finding these gold nuggets. So basically, I mean, I think I've read Orthodoxy now probably 10 times or so. It's just one of those books I've gone back to a lot. And I got to this place where I thought, there really needs to be a very nice version of this book that's nicely typeset, that beautiful cover, just really, the feel of the book really to show how much this book actually deserves to be treated well. But I thought, for first timers trying to get into this book, it's really hard. What if I just did some things like break up some of the paragraphs? Because, just like these guys from 100 years ago, they wrote these extraordinarily lengthy paragraphs. And so I wanted to break up the paragraphs, maybe do some subheadings so that people could follow the train of thought a little bit more, do a little intro at the beginning of each chapter to kind of let you know, this is what this chapter is and where you're going, some things to look for on the way. And then on the back end, have a summary to say, hey, here's what just happened. Some discussion questions, like here's how and then to go through. And the thing about Orthodoxy that really, really trips people up is that Chesterton is constantly referring to historical happenings, events, places, and people that today we have absolutely no context for. And so the annotations are there basically to say, okay, you have no idea who this person is, but let me just tell you who this person is, why, and then you can kind of figure out, oh, that's why Chesterton's referring to this person or that person, or this place in England that you've never been to, that you don't know what it is, like to kind of understand how the flow of the argument works. So you don't get bogged down in some of those details. So it really, for me, it was a labor of love. I love that book. I love Chesterton. And, I wanted to be able to introduce people to that book in a way that would keep them reading, rather than have them give up and miss out on some of the treasures that you find in it.
What do you think that his message is for the church today?
Well, the thing about Chesterton, he wrote so much, you'd say there could be a lot of messages depending on which way you get into Chesterton. Because he wrote all kinds of literature, but I would say from the apologetic standpoint, which is really where he's most appreciated by evangelicals today, I would say the big message from Chesterton is a gratitude for existence, first and foremost. That's that fundamental insight that it is better to exist than to not exist, that really douses the flames of nihilism or any kind of just hopelessness or despair in the world. The gratitude for existence being the first thing. I think there's something about that then awakens in people a sense of awe and wonder at the world, to where he helps you to see the world, to see the church, to see Christianity with an entirely, like, to take things that have become overly familiar to us and make them fresh to us. Chesterton has that through his wit and through his wisdom, it has that ability to be able to do that. So I think not taking for granted the amazingness, the astonishing nature of reality and of Christianity, I think is the first big thing. And from an example standpoint, just his ability to be really good friends with people who he was completely opposed to philosophically, who he thought were ideologically dangerous, actually. And yet to have that sort of, there's a cheerfulness to Chesterton that comes out of this strong sense of confidence that, God's got this, right? So he's often called the laughing prophet, because there's this very strong prophetic streak to him. And yet there's this joviality that's really, it's a strange juxtaposition. His prophetic call and nature and warnings, even, with this cheerful confidence and joviality that comes from him. And it's extraordinarily appealing and attractive when you meet like this gigantic personality like that. So I think that's why he has stood this test of time and why he continues to be relevant and read even today.
Give us an example of how he was prophetic. I'm really curious to see how he was prophetic into the culture.
I mean, one of the things that he said back in the 1930s, for example, was that the next big crises that Western civilization is going to face is going to be a crisis around the meaning and significance of sexuality, the sexual revolution. He saw that coming in the 1930s, where he basically, and this is after World War I, it's before World War II, where he recognized, the next insanities in his mind were not going to come from Germany as much as they were going to come from Manhattan. Like he recognized and saw ahead of time this sense in which the world, and he even says things even in Orthodoxy and in other books that pretty soon common sense things are going to be turned upside down, and the very definitions of words are going to change. That we're going to have, where people will be driven out of society basically by stating what's obvious and what everyone knows to be true. Like that, the actual common sense truths will become uncommon, and there will be all sorts of things that are, because they're ideologically driven, will be this sort of facade that becomes what's taken for reality. And so you read some of these lines and some of these statements from, 80, 90, 100 years ago, and you think, it's as if he were looking 100 years into the future and was seeing a lot of what was happening. But it's because he had this mind that could trace out the philosophical endpoints of a lot of what he was doing. I mean, not all of Chesterton's work fits that prophetic nature, but he saw, for example, that he wrote a book called Eugenics and Other Evils, in which he was really taking on the entire progressive establishment of his day in saying eugenics is dastardly. It's an extraordinarily pernicious and insidious ideology. And all the progressives at the time were lined up pro eugenics, that we've got to sort of create a better humanity by weeding out the less desirables and whatnot. And Chesterton saw that eugenics, its connection to birth control and then abortion as well, was going to create a society that would move in that direction. And so after World War II, of course, eugenics became unpopular, at least in the form that it had been in the 20s and 30s. But it still has not been unpopular. It's been actually extraordinarily successful when you look at at what's taken place in society since then, and even some of the rationale and reasoning behind some of the court decisions that we've had in the United States around, abortion and things like that, as to the populations that are more affected than others and what that actually looks like, or even when you see, people in different or cheering on different countries where people will say, "Oh, Down syndrome has almost been eradicated in Sweden or whatnot," and it's like, no, no, no. We've merely killed all the people that would have had Down syndrome. Like that's that. That all of that is present in Chesterton's foresight, and so yeah, extraordinarily interesting individual with a lot of insight into what was coming in the future.
Well, what led to his conversion? And I'm talking about from Protestantism to Catholicism. That's something that I think a lot of evangelicals have a tendency to kind of a bit of the question mark comes up to what do we do with him because of that.
Sure.
But what really led to that? Was it an intellectual? Was it a spiritual awakening? Was it a combination? What was it?
So, I think with Chesterton, you have to talk about two conversions, because his sort of conversion out of a deep, dark pit of despair in the 1890s and to sort of basically mere Christian orthodoxy, a sort of high Anglo, high Anglican ism. That's what starts first. So that happens, around the turn of the century. He basically becomes an apologist. At some level, he begins to argue for the existence of God. And then orthodoxy is in some ways is sort of his coming out as a Christian book, where he's basically saying, I agree with the basic essentials of Christianity. But and he even mentions in orthodoxy, he's not talking about the seat of authority, so to speak. So he's not answering the question about Anglicanism versus Catholicism or whatnot. That comes out in 1908. Chesterton actually converts in 1922 and probably would have converted. So it's 100 years ago this year, probably would have converted earlier had it not been for his wife, Frances, who was very devoutly Anglican. Chesterton's reasons for converting to Catholicism are really interesting. He writes about them in a lot of different places. There's when you read him as a Protestant, Chesterton was a journalist first and foremost, not a theologian. So he's not someone you really go to for theology as much as you go for his sort of take on the world. But as a theologian myself, reading him, I find a lot. Some places he's extraordinarily helpful, and then other places he's just completely off base. There's aspects of Puritanism that he gets right, critiques and whatnot. There's aspects of Calvinism critique that he gets right. Then there's aspects that I think he's really not read enough there, or hasn't actually gotten to the root of some of the reasons why, for example, in our day, someone like a John Piper, who is as Calvinistic as they come, loves G.K. Chesterton. It's almost like he realizes, yeah, Gilbert just doesn't really get the fact that same sort of sacred intoxication of existence is actually at the root of that gratitude for existence and salvation you can get in Reformed theology as well. Chesterton's reasons for converting, he would say very simply, well, I converted to have my sins forgiven, because he basically saw the church as providing the assurance of sins through confession, through the sacramental system and whatnot. But it's interesting. You read him, one of the reasons, or one of the things that pushes him towards Catholicism and away from Anglicanism, is that he really didn't believe Anglicans were acting like a church, like in the sense of there was all that conversation around the time about divorce, loosening restrictions on divorce and remarriage, and then also around birth control at the time as well. And so all of these things that basically he looks at Anglicanism, and then you have people that are, Anglican bishops and whatnot, kind of dancing around things like the virgin birth or the reality of miracles and whatnot. And so Chesterton is watching that sort of preceding the fundamentalist and modernist controversies that were beginning to happen in the US at the time. And I think his take was, he wants not a church that will move with the world, but a church that will move the world. And so Anglicanism begins to lose its luster as that church, and Catholicism at the time begins to really shine as that kind of church that's going to sort of resist the tides of modernity and things like that. And so that's part of that push from Chesterton from Anglicanism into Catholicism. And for reasons that even I myself would be sympathetic to in a lot of ways, although I wonder what Chesterton would say now about just some of the ways that the Catholic Church has developed, and how the Second Vatican Council has been used in Catholic circles, the spirit of Vatican II to push through a lot of different things that would have probably been somewhat appalling to Chesterton in some ways 100 years ago, or some of the discussions even now among some of the German bishops and whatnot. So as someone who follows Roman Catholic development from afar, with an appreciation, I think, for some of their public theology and their sort of Christian social teaching, it is interesting I do wonder at times what Chesterton would say today about the Catholic Church, or even if he would even say, would he say today about Catholicism what he said 100 years ago about Anglicanism? I mean, it's just interesting to think about what that might look like, or what his take would be on some of those current controversies in the Catholic Church.
Have you read that other book that came out recently about Chesterton, Matt Milner's book? Have you read his book on that? On Chesterton and Native American iconography?
Yeah, it's a fascinating book. Chesterton and the Everlasting People, I think, is the name of it. But yeah, it's fascinating the way he takes the sort of the story of the First Nations, Native Americans here in the United States, and then tries to bring Chesterton into discussion with that. Chesterton being extraordinarily anti-imperialist. So there's all of these seeds in Chesterton's work of that. Of course, you get at as you do with a lot of people of the time, he'll, the language of, the Red Indians or savages and things like that and whatnot that you recognize as typical there. But you also see Chesterton in the way that he is against the Boer War and about going against England's imperialistic mentality. He's a fascinating figure for so many reasons. Gandhi, for example, actually translated several of Chesterton's essays and then wound up using those as part of the basis for some of his work in India. So Chesterton is this figure. He doesn't quite fit any particular category. There's ongoing controversy about Chesterton. Was he anti-Semitic or not? There's all sorts of debates that would probably take us beyond the scope of this conversation. But Milner's example is just one in which I read the book and it was intriguing. I took away some insights. I also wondered, I don't know at what point this really captures Chesterton's vision of the world or of things, but at the same time, I thought this is the beauty of Chesterton, that, all sorts of people can have interaction with him and find it to be fruitful in some way.
I actually had met Matt. We were at Jerry Root's house. There's a group of guys that meets there on Thursday nights, and we're having this fireside conversation. And I didn't know who Matt was. And then he was writing and researching the book at the time, and he starts talking about G.K. Chesterton and his love for Native American iconography. And I'm like, who is this guy? Who knows about G.K. Chesterton? And I had to he leaned over to talk to somebody else, and I whipped out my phone to find out who he was. I was like, oh, he's got PhD from Princeton in art history. Okay, I guess he knows what he's talking
well, he's
about.
got a book on it now, so yeah, for sure. Yeah,
now he's got a book on it. So, but knowing that, as you mentioned, he's the laughing prophet, something that I find to be very. I'm drawn to that because you don't find that very often. You find people to be very somber, especially today. It's the Twitter wars. Everybody's yelling at one another, the culture wars, so on and so forth. So to have kind of a conciliatory person who's I don't know if he would be in the Babylon Bee-esque place of a little satire. Probably, I wouldn't put that past him. But looking at the church in America right now, and that prophetic nature of how many of those things that he talked about have been come to bear in society. Where do you see the church at right now? Because you've written a lot on where we're at, what's going on, but where do you see the American church right now?
I'm working actually on I'm working on a podcast potentially to start about just addressing what I think is a credibility crisis in the US. And it's a credibility crisis in the US church for a number of reasons. First and foremost, I think we'd all have to admit the sex abuse scandals that have touched virtually every denomination at some level those are horrifying, and those are there's nothing more damaging to the credibility of the church than seeing us not care for the least of these, or to have a blind eye or not be attentive to that conversation. So I think the ramifications of that are going to be with us for a long time. What I see happening right now in the American church, and one of the things that concerns me, is that when you see corruption in the church, which there is plenty of, when you see all sorts of excesses, leadership, toxic leadership stuff. I mean, you know, people listen to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast. And you see celebrity preachers, the fall of many of them, or you see people that weren't who we thought they were, people like Ravi Zacharias and others. There's that sense in which there's been a real reckoning, an unveiling, an apocalyptic moment in the church today. And it's happened both on the large scale with like well-known figures, but then it also happens on a smaller scale with stories that don't make headlines and yet leave people bewildered and wondering about the future of the church. I think the church is at a moment where there's a lot of rot in the church. And so it's a time for reformation and rebuilding. And unfortunately, a lot of times conservative leaning people, in order to protect the institution, wind up, not intentionally, but they wind up defending rot. And unfortunately, progressive leaning people, in order to purge the institution, wind up blowing up foundational pillars. Neither one of those serves the church well. You blow up foundations and sort of throw baby out with the bathwater, or you get rid of actually, like, for example, in the conversations about purity culture, there are aspects there are aspects of what was, kind of the whole push for true love waits and saving yourself for marriage and whatnot. There were aspects of the way that was taught in the 90s that were legalistic excesses that wound up being almost something of a pseudo prosperity gospel about sex. And I think a lot of it was well intentioned, but I mean, Josh Harris, obviously, I guess dating goodbye would be an example of that. So conservatives, I think those who lean more conservative tend to just overlook some of those problems that were created in that sort of that attempt to increase, purity among a younger generation in which there was a lot of temptation in the world, wind up defending rot there. Some that is really against the gospel. Matt Chandler's "Jesus Wants the Rose" video is a good example of a gospel approach to some of that excess. On the other hand, I hear a lot of talk about purity culture as if it's completely a bad thing. Whereas I think in a lot of terms, a lot of people that are more progressive leaning believe the Christian sexual ethic altogether is repressive or harmful, or if that we're stressing, virginity among our kids, or if we're trying to, hold them to the standard that God sets out for their own good and for his glory, that somehow that in itself is harmful. And that's for me, that's an example of conservatives defending rot and progressives blowing up pillars, and that sort of detaching from the great Christian tradition. So I think the task for us in the next generation is going to be a lot of rebuilding. We talk a lot about deconstruction these days. I think there's going to have to be a reconstructing project that takes place in which we actually remove the rot and we fortify the foundations. And I think we can do that at the same time. To do that well, we're going to have to know the difference between rot and foundations. And I think the only way you can really discern the difference between those two, though, is to be acquainted with the church throughout history and be acquainted with the church around the world. We need a good dose of church history, and we need a really strong connection to the global church. And I think that's how you're able to get out of this American chaos right now and have the right kind of perspective on the moment and what we should do moving forward.
I have to say how much I love that is we were talking in the pre-show walkthrough. That's actually what we see ourselves trying to do. We're trying to help with that, knowing that it takes a lot of different people being able to do that. But it's our contention that a lot of the things that we see going on globally is a real help to us, because we've been such a high Christendom culture for so long, and that rot has been allowed. And now that, as you said, it's been a real coming of age, or a reckoning. I love how you put that, the reckoning. How then do we try to then bring in that global aspect? Because that is something that we're very, very passionate about, and the historical part, because people have a tendency to think that the church just showed up lately. Like it's a 5-minute culture. We can't see really too far in the back. I was talking with Oz Guinness, and that's what his big lament was, is we've detached ourselves from history. We don't understand history. How do we then communicate to a society which seems to live more on TikTok than it does on their understanding of world history?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know that I have the best solution to that. I mean, at one level,
let's come up with it together, Trevin. Let's do it right now.
Chesterton has that line that is one of the most dangerous and most uncomfortable things for a man to do is to think. And this is why hardly ever anyone does it. So I think
he was so good with the quotes, little one-liners. I love
there's a line for everything. Like, that's the thing. There's a witty line from him for everything. No, but I think it requires a certain amount of both patience and humility. And those are two things that being online all the time are actively fought against. Patience, because everything is a quick fix culture. Like you said, I mean, you have everything just in a moment's notice. It's a TikTok video, it's a 10-second reel, that kind of thing. And then humility means you'd have to not only recognize that you don't know everything, but also recognize that the greater adventure in life is not discovering and inventing your own personal religion, but in submitting to something outside of yourself, to actually putting yourself under the scriptures, or in covenant with a local congregation of believers, recognizing that there's this 2,000 years of Christian history that cannot be jettisoned, that should not be jettisoned, but that actually needs to be considered, and then I think with the global church, I mean, nothing is more formative, I think, for people than having strong connections to people in other parts of the world. Because when you get to know people from other parts of the world who love Jesus, worship Jesus, have a very high view of the scriptures, want to submit to the scriptures, you very quickly realize what things are essential versus non-essential. Because believers in other parts of the world do not see American politics the same way that we do. They don't see the same categories that we do. They may have differences of perspective or posture based on the kind of culture that they're seeking to be a witness in. And so, there's all of these conversations going on about what should be the American, what should be the church's posture to, culture change in the United States? Or are we moving back into this moment where we really need culture warriors, or do we need to seek, convictional kindness kind of a thing? Like, there's all these debates over the posture. And I just don't think those debates get solved by just listening to Americans pontificate. I think we need the rest of the global church to offer perspective in those ways.
What do you think some of those things that they offer a perspective on?
Well, I think it's very easy for Americans it's very easy for us to confuse some of our idiosyncrasies, just those things that are sort of specific to an American context, to things that are like specific to or we can think that those things apply everywhere in every way. So
give me an example. Give us an example.
Yeah. So, I mean, for example, the particular view that many Americans would have on, I've used this example before, on like capital punishment. There's a lot of Americans, especially conservative Christians, who see capital punishment as not only biblical in principle, but also in practice, and would question really the ethical stance of any believer that sees that differently. Whereas you go in other parts of the world, Romania would be one example, where a lot of the believers in Romania, coming out of a dictatorial regime where capital punishment was used against all kinds of people, unfairly, would say, why would you ever want to give the government that kind of power? Like, that's not something that, and they're not necessarily argue against it biblically from the standpoint that there's no biblical justification for it. I think Romans 13 would make that to be a biblical justification, but would almost say, similar to the way that, many Christians in other parts of the world would say, that it's biblical in principle, but not always fairly applied in practice, so that it's permissible, but not necessarily commanded. Right. So, that's something that I remember as a young person being shocked by, because I realized, that sort of position that I had in my head was sort of just the biblical position is actually a position that, I mean, you can debate whether or not it's biblically biblical in the way it's applied or whatnot, but it's one of those things I realized that's not an essential. Like that's not something like that's actually something that Christians may have questions about or disagreements about or wonder about the prudence of in having to figure out how to apply it. And so there are all sorts of issues like that where you take you move away as you move away from where the Bible is super clear to areas of wisdom and judgment. There are brothers and sisters in other parts of the world who just apply things differently. Like that. In the U.S., a lot of believers would be against, and maybe for good reason, for prudential reasons, against like universal health care. There are other parts of the world where Christians are the ones who've spearheaded that. So it's just it's not, and I'm not saying anti or for. I've actually seen government paid universal health care in places where it's really gone really poorly, and then other places where culturally, because perhaps the size of the congregation or the size of the country, not congregation, the size of the country or the demographics of the country or how it works, where it's actually been more effective than in other places. All of those but that's all debate that can be had, right? Whereas a lot of times in the US, I think we tend to take certain political positions and we move away from principle of caring for the less fortunate, the needy, the sick, building hospitals, things like that. And we sort of harden into a particular view, and it sort of begins to be seen as this is the really biblical view. And anyone that would see this differently is probably, we wouldn't question their salvation necessarily, but question their wisdom or their judgment, or do they have, and I think opening up that global conversation then allows you to treat brothers and sisters even in the United States that may have differences of opinion when it comes to, some of those prudential political questions with more grace and charity, because you recognize, yeah, I may have really strong convictions on this, but this isn't an area of orthodoxy. This is not a pillar, so to speak. It's more of something that a church that the different people in a congregation could see this differently.
So they could agree to disagree on, but there's some judiciousness, I hope, some charity, as you said, in all where we talk about Augustine and
yeah,
charity,
but at the same time, it goes the other way. A lot of Christians in the United States today want to say, we can agree to disagree on issues related to the definition of marriage, for example. And in that situation, that's where basically the global church comes back and says no. And the church throughout history says, no, what are you thinking? So I mean, that sort of connection to the global church broadens your view on certain issues, but then also really narrows and targets your view on other issues where you recognize, no, we would be out of step, not only with the church throughout the last 2,000 years, but also with the global church around the world, if we were to make a change on this particular issue. So that's why you need that perspective, so that you're able to have those conversations and to recognize what are the places where we really need to be able to say, here I stand, I can do no other. And then where are those areas where it's like, yeah, I'm standing here and you're standing there, and it's okay. We're brothers and sisters, and we can continue along in partnering in mission and all sorts of things. Those are issues, I think, where we really need the wisdom of church history and the global church.
I could not agree more with your assessment on that. But that also leads me to another question. Yes, we know the negatives. We talk about the negatives all the time in the American church, and yet we want to solve those by, or at least temper that, if you will, with the global church and understanding of church history. But what do you think that the modern American church now is doing well?
Well, I think the modern American church does a lot of things well. There's a level of confidence. I mean, at times people would say it's almost abrasive because it's almost so aggressive. And it's the American church's confidence in thinking it can influence the society for good. There's a lot of countries that don't have that. So I was talking with a Canadian friend who's a pastor not that long ago, and was saying one of the things that he loves about American churches is that American churches really do believe they can impact society. Whereas Canadian churches, evangelical ones anyway, a lot of times are just, not really, they're only seeing things on the local level, not really thinking about what they might be able to do long term. So there's this sort of confidence in the public witness of the faith that when done correctly can lead to widespread societal change. And I think that you do see that in other parts of the world as well, but the American context may be somewhat unique in that. So I think that that's one of the strengths of the United States. It's kind of the counterpoint to the weakness that I just mentioned. If the American church at times is too politicized as a weakness, the strength from that is the American church really does a lot of good. And that's one of the beautiful things to look at when, there are no headlines about this, but the American church is really good at caring for neighbors in distress and at disaster relief, for example. I mean, some of the American churches are the ones that are running to places where suffering is taking place with arms outstretched faster than just about anyone else. And so that's beautiful. I think, there's been a lot of conversation recently about the Roe v. Wade decision with abortion and whatnot. But I mean, what often doesn't get as much press or get as much focus is the fact that, crisis pregnancy centers and pregnancy and family support centers outnumber abortion clinics 2-to-1 in the United States. All across the country, there's been this, this grassroots movement that's really spectacular to watch, funded by the church, So I think the American church does a really does a really good job in a lot of different areas that it doesn't get as much credit for, that I think we should continue to fan the flames for those things and celebrate those wins.
I know that when we're talking about the American church and how it does that, it is always fascinating to me to see how the critics try to caricature and say, you should take care of the whole woman. And there was a Twitter entry it was maybe a year or two ago, where a woman had said that, and the response that she got from people saying what they had done caused her to make a public apology. And I thought that was just fascinating to see how many people have come around and done that. And I would agree with you on that. Continuing that kind of thread on the American culture and where things are headed right now, you wrote in your blog on Disney. Why do we need to care about Disney? Because I do know that there are a lot of Christians, that care, that have young children, that want to talk about it. But some who have been around for the last few decades remember the kind of boycott in the 90s, the late 90s, and how that really didn't have a greater effect. And you write about this, and you're saying this is a lot different than it was then to now. Describe that. Talk about that. What made you really want to bring that out? We know it's in the culture and in the mindset of many people now, but what do we do, and why do we need to talk about Disney?
I think this conversation started because of Disney, not because of anyone else. I think there was what precipitated all of these conversations recently about Disney were some of the creatives and the executives that were on certain teams that were basically saying they wanted to push a sexual ideology into the messaging for kids. So, we've got all sorts of corporate America has taken all sorts of positions. Big companies take all sorts of positions on all sorts of stuff that we would disagree with, I think, as Christians. Some of it's just virtue signaling, but it happens. I think the difference between Disney and like Pepsi, for example, is, Pepsi can take whatever stand they want on a particular issue or do a commercial that may, offend our Christian sensibilities or whatnot. And yeah, people may choose not to drink Pepsi or whatever, but they're not actually changing the product. Like they're not actually inserting something into Pepsi. Whereas Disney, it's different because it's this trustworthy, family-friendly entertainment juggernaut, right? That is an American institution that has an outsized influence on entertainment in the United States. We talk about kids, but we got to talk about everything from Star Wars to Marvel to ABC to ESPN to Hulu. Disney is not just Disney World. It's this massive conglomerate at this point. And there is outsized influence into entertainment. And we know that entertainment shapes and forms young minds. And no one has been more trusted than Disney when it comes to the minds of kids. So when you've got people openly on video saying, we want to basically insert, the ideology of the sexual revolution into programming for kids in order to affect cultural change. Well, yeah, that gets a lot of parents their alarm bells going off. And now, I mean, in the defense of the creatives would be saying, "Oh, we just want to increase representation, right?" They don't really see it as a political thing; they see it as a moral obligation to show representation of all the different sexual identities out there. But I mean, we're talking about entertainment programming for kids that generally has been very non-sexualized, in for the most part. So that's what I think has gotten a lot of parents concerned. And when I wrote about this, I wasn't writing about this to say you should boycott Disney or you should not boycott Disney or you should. All I wanted to say was actually this goes back further than you realize, and this is not. If just now you're beginning to pay attention to the messaging that comes through Disney shows or Disney movies, you've not paid attention long enough, because there's actually an entire philosophy of life that has taken root since the 1800s that has become more and more pervasive in society in the past 50 to 75 years. And Disney movies have both reflected and accelerated that trend. And it's this way of life that says the purpose and meaning of life is to look deep inside yourself, to discover who you are, and then to follow the dreams of your heart and chase your dreams until you become and express whoever you were meant to be. That is, I mean, the philosophical term from that is expressive individualism. It is the dominant narrative in most Disney movies, everything from The Little Mermaid to, even Aladdin to Mulan to whatever it might be, even from the 90s. So my point in that blog article was not to say, stop watching all the Disney movies, never listen to a Disney soundtrack. I mean, we're fans of Disney at our house, as most families are. But to be able to have those deeper conversations where it may not have anything to do with sex or transgenderism or anything like that, that philosophy of life that has taken root and is now common sense in society is something that is actually not the biblical view of the world. And so, I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Rethink Yourself, which is about this very topic. It was basically to say, hey, there is this way of looking at life that says you look in first, then you look around to others for affirmation, and then you look up to God for some kind of higher power inspiration or something like that to basically sanction the life that you've defined for yourself. The Bible's way of life is exactly opposite of that. You look up first to God's design and his intent. You look around to the people that he has placed in your path. And then you look in to discover the best way that you live out, Christian discipleship in a way that brings, that edifies the church and then brings glory to him. That is a very countercultural way of looking at life. And unless you understand the differences between those two ways of life, you're going to, the big challenge for the church today is, unless we help people see that look in way of life versus that look up way of life, we're going to have people who are just looking in and they're basically following the Disney mantra with a little bit of God sprinkled on top, and the church helping them to be everything that they've always wanted to be, rather than recognizing that their entire reason for existence is supposed to revolve around God at the center, not themselves at the center. So I think the Disney conversation matters, not just because it's about Disney, but because it's about this way that we look at life and helping us to be able to see through what passes for common sense in our society today, and to have a better framework for thinking through that, and allowing the Bible to, to counter us at times and to counter that common sense way of thinking.
What do you see yourself in this conversation about America? We're talking about the global church. We're talking about how we see ourselves. I mean, these are all currents of thought that are carrying people along, and yet you're standing for biblical truth in the middle of that. What do you see yourself as your role right now? What has God called you to do in the middle of all this?
Yeah. So, I mean, from a vocational standpoint, I mean, I am excited to be at the North American Mission Board, where I can think like a missiologist and then help to provide resources for pastors that will be free and will be useful in a lot of different areas, a lot of different ways, to really serve planters and pastors in that way. For me, just backing up, one step beyond just my day-to-day job, I think, the Lord has given me these opportunities through cross-cultural mission work over the years to be able to see the culture that I've been placed in back in the United States, to be able to see that from the outside looking in. So the opportunities I've had over the years have been formative in that I can come at society with a different set of eyes and lens, to then look at society. And then I think I look at myself as, let me help the American church as much as possible, and American church leaders and thoughtful lay people in American congregations. I want to help them see the culture and the society around them as the mission field, to be able for them to see the opportunities and challenges that we face here, in a way that helps them be more effective. And so, an aspect of that for me is popularizing higher shelf content and thought on some of those issues. So, if Tim Keller, for example, translates down this massive work of Charles Taylor, I want to be the guy who's maybe translating down even Tim Keller, putting on one shelf lower, just so that people without Bible knowledge, without, the philosophical terms and things like that, can really understand what's going on and be able to be helped and to see American society for what it is, and then be able to be more effective in mission and ministry in that way.
I think that's a phenomenal awareness that you have on your calling, especially as you see, and you wrote about this double literacy loss that we have today with an understanding of the Bible. And I don't know if you've seen it. I'm sure you probably have. The American Bible Society released their Bible report, and it's not good news. I mean, Bible reading is down 11%. They said the disenchanted or disengaged Bible reader is up 38%, the largest jump they've ever seen in history. So to see what you're doing and trying to translate that down, I just want to commend you for that, to keep that up. What final words of encouragement could you give to our listeners today?
I take encouragement in, the two areas that we talked about before, church history and the global church. I'm encouraged when I think about church history, because I realize the church is always a mess. So like the idea that
truer words have not been spoken.
I mean, everyone joked about the pandemic and that word unprecedented. With the church, it's like, there's really hardly anything that's really unprecedented.
Right. There's nothing new under the sun, right?
No.
I mean, come on.
The church needs reformation. Oh, really? That's a new one. You know what I mean? So now that doesn't sound really encouraging at first, except when you realize, like, the way I like to say it is, we are a bungling bunch of believers and have been for 2,000 years. So let's not overstate the problems. Let's just recognize, the fact that we've got challenges. Every church and every generation has challenges. It's just, they may be different, but there are going to be some challenges. So I take encouragement in that, and I would leave people with that just sort of perspective. But then also the global church is also the challenge there is also encouraging. God is on the move. There's all sorts of amazing things that are happening right now around the world. I mean, Christianity is exploding in other parts of the world, just exploding. And so there's a lot to take heart from. There's a lot of mess that's happening in other parts of the world too. So you look at that and say, well, the American church doesn't have a corner on corruption. There's all sorts of problems that are happening all over the place. And at the same time as that explosive growth, it was the best of times and the worst of times, Charles Dickens says. And I kind of look at the American church and say, even today, it's the same. The way we'll tie this up by going back to Chesterton. A lot of times people think that the world is either on this interminable decline, slide into this abyss, or that the world is just getting better and better and better. The progressives tend to think of themselves on the vanguard of the world getting more and more and closer to this utopia, whereas a lot of times pessimistic types tend to look at everything and think everything's going crazy. I was having a conversation not that long ago with someone who said, things are just so much worse than it was 60 years ago, immorally, in so many different areas, and like, it's just slide. And I was like, yeah, in some of these areas, you're right. But, you talk to someone who's African-American and they'll tell you they'd rather live now than they would have wanted to live in the 1960s. So it's all depending on perspective. On certain things are getting worse. Yes, certain things are getting better. That's the way it is. And what Chesterton always says is, the world is not getting better or getting worse. There's one thing the world does. It wobbles. And so I just think, the world is wobbling, and to have a sure foot and to be able to stay steady when the world is wobbling, you need to come back to the gospel, to the truth of the scriptures, and you need to be able to stake your claim there. And a lot of people say, oh, you Christian types are just digging in. I'm like, we're not digging in, we're just standing. And we can stand with confidence and we can stand with cheerfulness. You don't have to be mad about it, because there's a sense in which we know truth that stands the test of time, and we're confident that God's purposes for the world are going to be complete. We don't know they're going to be accomplished. We don't know what it's going to look like, but we trust that He's in control, and we know what the end looks like.
That is a wonderfully encouraging statement, Trevin. I mean, just the whole thing, to be able to realize that, because I think you're right. I think a lot of people do think that things are getting so much worse. What's going to happen? It's the woe is me. The whole world is on fire, and yet God is still accomplishing His purpose. And I said the same thing you have. It's good it's bad on some levels, and it's really good on other levels, and it's never ever just a one-time or one-size-fits-all approach. But I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. How can people follow along with what you're doing?
No, the easiest way to follow along for me is just if you go to my website. If you just go to trevinwax.com, it'll take you to my column at the Gospel Coalition, and at the end of every post, every article that I do there's a way to subscribe to my email list. And I like to send out all sorts of random stuff to my email list. I mean, it's not random, but it's just, my articles I'll send out there, but then also just something I may be reading, or I'm a big classic TV fan. So I generally once a week I'll have a classic TV clip, and sometimes some links to some interesting stuff I've been seeing online, or maybe, a podcast recommendation per week. So it's just a place to keep in touch, and for me to be able to connect with readers. And it's one of the most fun things that I get to do is that. So.
Well, that's awesome. I want to thank you for coming on Apollos Water.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a joy.